Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something pretty fundamental for anyone invested in the markets. How well is the SEC actually doing its job?
Yes, specifically, we're looking at their workload. How much does being swamped affect their ability to police financial reporting?
Exactly. We're digging into a study that uses some really interesting data to see how case backlogs in the SEC's regional offices impact, well, everything, which companies get investigated, how long it takes, and even the penalties.
And this is based on research by Bonsall, Holzman, and Miller. What's cool is they got their hands on a data set that shows not just the public SEC cases, but the confidential ones too.
Which is a big deal, right? Because so much of the SEC's work historically wasn't visible. This gives us a much clearer picture of how busy they really are.
It does. And this matters to you, the listener, because, well, we need the SEC to be effective for market confidence. If they're overwhelmed, what does that mean for investor protection?
And there has been a recent dip in enforcement actions, which makes you wonder.
So this study tries to get at that. When they say busy, they mean basically the number of cases piling up in a regional office, while the number of staff stays, pretty much the same.
More work, same resources.
Pretty much.
So our mission today is to unpack this. How does the SEC's workload affect its role as a watchdog? Does being busy mean big things get missed? Let's find out.
Okay, so first big finding. What happens when a company has to restate its financials? That's usually a huge red flag, right?
Absolutely. You'd think that jumps to the top of the pile.
Well, here's the thing. The study found that when a regional SEC office has a higher backlog, it's actually less likely to investigate a company that just restated its financials.
Wait, really? Less likely? How much less likely are we talking?
The numbers suggest about a 10.4% lower relative likelihood of investigating a restatement for every standard deviation increase in that office's backlog.
10%. Wow. So if the local SEC office is buried in cases, a company restating its numbers might just sort of slip through the cracks?
That's what the data seems to suggest. It's a direct hit to accountability.
But hang on, couldn't the SEC just, I don't know, move resources around? If the New York office is swamped, can't Chicago or D.C. step in?
Logically, you'd think so. Maybe shift cases or personnel. But the study's results indicate these regional backlogs are real bottlenecks.
So it's not that simple.
Apparently not. They actually talked to enforcement division agents who confirmed that, yeah, geography where the company's base is usually the main factor deciding which office investigates.
So a busy local office really can mean less scrutiny.
Okay, that's worrying. What about the SEC's own stated priorities? Do those get affected by the backlog?
That's where it gets nuanced. They looked at two areas the SEC always talks about. Problems with revenue recognition.
Right, a classic accounting issue.
And cases where executives were selling off lots of stock during the period when the financials were wrong.
Insiders selling during the misstatement period. Got it. And for those, the backlog didn't seem to matter. Busy or not, the SEC was just as likely to investigate those kinds of restatements. So they are sticking to those priorities.
Okay, that's somewhat reassuring. They're still going after those specific red flags, even when stretched thin. But what about investor harm? The amount of money lost?
Yeah, you'd think that would be paramount. Protecting investors from the biggest losses.
Definitely.
But surprisingly, the study found the opposite. Higher backlogs were linked to a lower chance of investigating the cases with the biggest shareholder losses.
Hold on. Lower. Why on earth would they be less likely to investigate the cases where investors got hit the hardest? That seems backwards.
The researchers think it boils down to complexity and time. Those huge loss cases. They're often messy, complicated, and take a long time to investigate properly.
So if an office is already drowning,
they might shy away from starting another massive resource-draining investigation, even if the losses are huge. It's a potential trade-off they face.
that is deeply concerning. The idea that the worst offenses, financially speaking, might get a pass because the regulator is too busy.
It suggests the workload could be seriously undermining their ability to tackle the most damaging misconduct.
Okay, what else did they find regarding priorities when the SEC is busy? Any other factors?
Yes, they looked at lobbying. Specifically, did the restating company lobby the government recently? And they found that busier SEC offices were less likely to investigate the companies that had been lobbying.
So does that imply, maybe, that lobbying provides some kind of buffer when the SEC is overloaded?
That's one interpretation the study puts forward, that political connections might offer a bit of insulation, specifically when resources are tight.
Interesting. Okay, so busyness affects whether they investigate, but what about the investigations they do decide to pursue? Does the workload impact those too?
It seems so. The study found that higher regional backlogs were linked to investigations dragging on longer.
Taking more time to finish makes sense, I guess.
And, importantly, a lower chance of the SEC issuing what's called an Accounting and Auditing Enforcement Release, an AER.
Right, the AER. Remind us why that's significant.
Well, the AER is basically the SEC's formal public announcement that they've taken enforcement action on an accounting or auditing issue. It's the public slap on the wrist, or sometimes much more than a slap.
So it's about transparency and deterrence.
Exactly. These are high profile. They send a message to the market. Fewer AERs could mean less public accountability and maybe a weaker deterrent effect overall.
Okay, longer investigations, fewer public announcements. What about the actual penalties? If a company is penalized when the SEC office is busy, are the consequences different?
Yes, according to the study. For those cases that did result in penalties, higher backlogs were associated with smaller monetary penalties from the SEC.
Smaller fines.
Smaller fines, and also a lower likelihood that the SEC would require the company to make changes to its corporate governance.
Wow. So even if they catch you, if they're busy, the punishment might be later.
That's what the evidence suggests. Fewer investigations, longer timelines, fewer public actions, and potentially weaker sanctions. It paints a picture of an agency really strained by its workload.
Definitely. Now, you mentioned a ripple effect on private lawsuits. How does the SEC's busyness connect to shareholder class actions?
Right, this was another interesting angle.
Yeah.
The study suggests that when the SEC is busier and brings fewer enforcement actions, that actually leads to fewer shareholder class action lawsuits being filed.
Why is that? If shareholders lost money, wouldn't they sue anyway?
You'd think so, but the SEC often does a lot of the heavy lifting. An SEC investigation and enforcement action can uncover evidence and establish facts that make it much easier for private lawyers to build a successful class action case.
Ah, so the SEC action kind of paves the way.
In many cases, yes. It provides a foundation. If the SEC isn't bringing as many actions because they're overloaded, that foundation might be missing, making private lawsuits riskier and harder to pursue.
So a busy SEC doesn't just affect public enforcement, it can weaken private enforcement too. That's a really important connection.
Did the study compare this to other parts of the SEC?
They did. They contrasted these findings with studies looking at the SEC's Division of Corporation Finance. That's the part that reviews company filings, sends comment letters, and so on.
Okay, different function. How did they react to being busy?
Some research suggests that when CorpFin gets busy, they might actually focus more intensely on the worst examples of non-compliance they find in filings. Sort of like triage.
Interesting. So CorpFin might double down on the worst problems, but the enforcement division, when busy, seems less likely to pursue the cases with the biggest investor losses.
Exactly. It highlights a potentially critical difference in how workload pressures affect different regulatory functions. Enforcement investigations are a much bigger commitment, resource-wise, and carry potentially much heavier consequences than comment letters.
Which might explain the different reactions to being overloaded. That makes sense. Did they look at why those big loss cases take longer? Yes. They confirmed that investigations into restatements linked to the largest shareholder losses took significantly longer, about 27% longer on average.
Nearly a third longer, okay?
Which, again, helps explain why a resource-strapped office might hesitate to start one. These aren't quick wins.
Right. But didn't you say the lobbying cases were associated with shorter investigation?
Correct. Lobbying activity was linked to faster investigation times, interestingly.
So for those politically connected firms, the reason they might avoid investigation when the SEC is busy isn't because their cases would take too long. It must be something else.
Yeah, the length doesn't seem to be the barrier there. It points back towards that idea of perhaps political influence or connections playing a role when the agency is stretched thin.
Okay, let's try and pull this all together. What are the main things we should take away from this deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway is that SEC regional office workload, just being plain busy, seems to really matter. It's not just an internal problem for them. It appears to significantly impact their effectiveness.
Yeah, it affects the likelihood of investigating major red flags like restatements.
Especially, and perhaps most worryingly, those linked to the largest shareholder losses.
And even when they do investigate, the process takes longer. It's less likely to result in a public enforcement action like an AAR, and the penalties might be smaller.
Plus, that spillover effect, weakening the potential for private shareholder lawsuits too. It's a whole chain of consequences.
And that finding about the largest shareholder losses being less likely to be investigated when they're busy, that just feels fundamentally at odds with the SEC's mission to protect investors, you know?
It really does. It strongly suggests that workload constraints could be preventing the SEC from being the strong deterrent it needs to be, particularly for the most significant types of financial misreporting.
So, the final thought for you, the listener, is really about the bigger picture. What does it mean for market integrity, for your investments, if the main financial watchdog is perhaps wearing out under its own workload?
Mhm. It prompts questions about whether the SEC has the resources it needs, how it prioritizes cases under pressure, and what the right mix is between public regulators like the SEC and private actions by investors themselves to keep the markets fair. Lots to chew on there.